For many PhD students, research ethics first appears as paperwork. There's an application form, there's a series of boxes to fill in about things like informed consent, the right to withdraw, data storage, dissemination. You're asked to explain how you'll protect participants, store data securely, anonymise transcripts, how long you'll hold on to the recordings, and what will happen to the data after publication. And very quickly, it can begin to feel procedural, administrative, like it's something you've got to complete correctly before you're allowed to do your research. But for those doing qualitative studies in particular, there's a subtle tension underneath that process. You don't just want ethical approval and see it as a box to tick. You want to complete your research with integrity. You want to know that in your research with participants, you've been careful, you've been responsible, you've been respectful. And this is when qualitative research ethics becomes more than just compliance. Because that lengthy application form you fill in, that isn't the real work. The real work, when it comes to ethics, is judgment. Many PhD students believe that they're struggling with the ethics application itself. But more often than not, what they're actually struggling with is this. They've not fully considered what the research is asking of the participants, but also what the research is asking of them. Ethics in qualitative research aren't something that you just attach, you just bolt on after your research design is complete. It's woven through your research questions, your methodological choices, your paradigm leanings, your relationship to participants, and your positionality as a researcher. If that thinking is still blurred, then questions about informed consent, anonymity, confidentiality, those can begin to feel quite difficult to answer. On the other hand, if that thinking is clear, then the ethics application process becomes what it should be, which is essentially a translation exercise. You're simply articulating decisions that you've already made, things that you've already reasoned your way through. Rather than treating ethics as a checklist, I want to frame it as 4 interrelated pillars: risk, care, power, and responsibility. And we're going to think this through using an example study. Imagine a qualitative PhD that's looking at the experiences of first-generation students in their first year of university. It's an in-depth interview study, and it's going to examine things like belonging and confidence and adjusting to that academic environment. And there's nothing sensational about this topic. There's nothing that screams at you that there's an inherent risk in it. And yet, it is ethically quite complex. So let's have a look at the first pillar, risk. When ethics forms ask us about potential risks to participants, often where our mind goes first is towards the physical risks, so slipping over, tripping on a cable. But that's not really what we're dealing with here. Risk in this context is often much more subtle than that. So in the example study, asking someone to describe a moment when they felt they didn't belong, that's something that might carry emotional weight. Reflecting on academic self-doubt might expose vulnerability. And in a small department, even anonymised quotations might be recognisable to people. Comments about lecturers or institutional culture might carry social or reputational risk if those comments can be traced back to an individual. Risk operates on a spectrum, and whilst it's rarely dramatic, it's often relational. And our job as qualitative researchers isn't to wrap our participants up in cotton wool and prevent any discomfort whatsoever. The task here isn't to eliminate all risk, it's to recognise where risk might arise and consider what we can do to mitigate that. And this is where things like informed consent begin to matter in a really substantive way. Not as a signature on a form, but as an honest conversation about what participation involves, what topics might be discussed, what data will be recorded, and how that data will be used in dissemination and in publication. If risk is about anticipating harm, care is about how that is embodied in the research design. How will you take care of ethical principles, and how will you ensure that they are upheld through what you do in your research? When you describe informed consent in your ethics application form, the question isn't simply about getting people to sign a document. It is about whether consent is genuinely informed and whether it remains ongoing. And sometimes we've got to think beyond the traditional consent form here. In methods like qualitative interviews, consent is rarely a single event. It may need to be revisited if conversations move into unexpected territory, and participants have got to feel able to pause, to decline to answer, or to exercise their right to withdraw, and that right must be meaningful. If someone wants to withdraw from your study during or after an interview, what happens to that recording? Is it deleted entirely? Are any transcripts that you produce destroyed? How long after an interview can people exercise that right to withdraw? And have you explained all this clearly in advance? Care also extends to data protection and data storage. Where will any audio files be kept? Are they encrypted? Who has access to them? How long will they be retained for? How and when will they be destroyed? Care is also the pillar where the distinction between confidentiality and anonymity becomes important. Confidentiality means that what participants tell you inside the research context is not shared outside of that in a way in which they could be identified. And the thing with confidentiality in qualitative research is that it can't always be absolute. In most qualitative projects, there are limits to confidentiality. For example, if a participant was to disclose information to you which suggests that there's a significant risk of harm to themselves or to others, you've got a duty to report that. And there are types of disclosure that might trigger institutional or legal obligations, and you really need to be aware of that. And that's why you don't ever promise blanket confidentiality to your participants in any information you give to them about the research. So, for example, in your participant information sheet. Instead, you very clearly explain the limits of confidentiality. Anonymity is something different, and I very often see anonymity and confidentiality being used interchangeably when people are talking about research ethics, but we've got to be really clear that these two are not the same thing. Anonymity basically means that your participants' identities can't be inferred from looking at your research. Now, this isn't just about giving your participants pseudonyms or participant numbers when your research is written up. So the name that appears underneath the quote in your chapter isn't the person's real name. It's about way more than that. It's about thinking through other things that they've shared with you that could identify them. So is there a unique way of speaking that could easily relate back to an individual? Turns of phrase that are distinct to them? Or very specific details that they share about an experience they've had? It's not just about keeping people's names out of your thesis. It's about thinking of ways in which their identities might be conveyed in what they've shared with you, in what they say and how they say it. When you're researching with small groups though, true anonymity, that can be difficult to achieve if you've used quite immersive methods like ethnography, or where you're using techniques like interpretative phenomenological analysis. Ethical maturity means being honest about that, both with your participants and in your written work. Power is the pillar that appears the least explicitly on ethical application forms, yet it shapes everything. You decide the questions you're asking. You decide what quotes and what extracts get included in your thesis. You interpret what your participants' experiences mean. You determine how the findings are framed, how they're written up, how they're presented. That is narrative power. Even in relatively informal conversational interviews, power imbalances exist. Thinking back to our example study, when we're looking at the experiences of first-generation university students, if you were doing that research, You as a researcher have a bit of status in that dynamic. The participants might be looking up to you. They might be careful about being too critical of things that they think you might believe in. They might assume that certain viewpoints, certain answers are more legitimate than others. Power also operates in representation. So, to use the example again, if you were to frame those first generation university students in terms of their struggle or the things that they don't have, what kind of story then enters the academic record about that? On the other hand, if you start emphasising things like resilience, does that mean that there are structural challenges that get obscured or become less clear than they were? Ethical thinking at doctoral level, it requires a really strong awareness of this interpretive authority. It requires you to be reflective as well as reflexive. And if you're wondering about the difference between those two, I will pop a link to a video on the screen right now in which I go through that in quite a lot more detail. And I'll also put the link in the description for later. Now, before we move on to look at responsibility, I want to hear from you in the comments. So where are you at the moment in terms of ethics? Are you working on your ethics application at the moment? Have you submitted it and you're waiting for a decision? Have you received your ethical approval and you're out there doing your research? How are you feeling at this stage in the process? What are you unsure about? What are you worried about? Drop your thoughts down there in the comments. Responsibility gathers those previous three pillars together. It's about the longer term implications of your research. It's about your responsibility to the participants, to the wider community that are represented in your research, to the integrity of your analysis, and to yourself as a researcher. Responsibility includes thinking about when and how your findings are going to be published and disseminated. Is this simply going to be published as your thesis, or are you going to use it in other ways? At conferences, as a book, a research monograph, are you going to use it to inform some kind of documentary? Are you going to use it to shape teaching materials? And what are the implications of that for your participants and their community? It's also about the follow-up. So are you one of those researchers who is going to helicopter in, get their data, and then make a sharp exit, never to be seen or heard of again by the participants? Or are you going to think more carefully about your exit, about your departure from that research environment and how that's going to be managed? That is very important when you develop rapport and relationships with participants. What's going to happen after the research? So are you going to go back and talk to them about what happens? Is there a plan for an ongoing conversation? And finally, responsibility also includes you and your well-being. Repeatedly listening to people's in-depth experiences, people's in-depth accounts, which can often include things that are quite sensitive, quite traumatic, that can take its toll on you as a researcher. That is emotional labour. You need to think about things like pacing, having gaps between interviews, having adequate supervisory support around you when you're in the field. You've got to think about your boundaries. Qualitative researcher burnout is real. If you become depleted, your judgment shifts, and that then has a knock-on effect on everything else. And that is not a personal failing, that is a professional reality when you're doing qualitative research. You are required to have formal ethical approval for your PhD study, and that process matters. But one thing that is really important to remember is that ethics committees are very rarely looking for risk-free research, because that just doesn't exist. What they are looking for is coherence. Can you explain how informed consent will operate in practice? Can you articulate the limits of confidentiality and anonymity in your specific context? Can you adequately explain your data protection procedures? Can you describe how participants' right to withdraw will be honoured? Can you show that your dissemination plans are thoughtful and proportionate? And when you can start giving meaningful answers to these questions, You've moved beyond thinking about ethics as a bureaucratic box ticking form filling exercise, and you've actually started to think about it in a meaningful way around concepts that all qualitative researchers can understand and recognise, things like risk, care, power, responsibility. And that is the level of thinking that doctoral research requires. If you found this video helpful, there are another couple appearing on your screen right now that you might also enjoy. So go and check those out. I'll see you in there.